Titanfall 2's single-player campaign has probably been one of the most pleasant surprises I've ever experienced in all of my time playing video games. When I heard that Titanfall 2 was going to include a single-player campaign, I remember rolling my eyes at the idea of playing a 3-hour glorified tutorial with no thought or care put into it. But then I played Titanfall 2's campaign for the first time, and I was very happy to be wrong. The first couple of missions were pretty decent, but nothing too mind-blowing, as they mostly focused on teaching the mechanics and controls. It was in the Tick Room in Blood and Rust when I first noticed the level design was above average, but it wasn't until I reached the Simulation Dome that I realized the campaign was going to be something special.
Now, we shall see how impressive you truly are.
I still remember inviting my friends into an Xbox Live party after I beat the campaign and asking them if they had played that level yet. Titanfall 2's campaign gave me a feeling that I hadn't experienced in years. A feeling of pure awe as the credits rolled. It's a feeling that's been sadly absent in most recent AAA games, which is why playing Titanfall 2's campaign was such a breath of fresh air. It isn't perfect, but no game really is. And honestly, nobody expects perfection. What people do expect is to see care, affection, and effort put into every level, cutscene, and firefight. And in this regard, Respawn blew our expectations out of the water. I think it's safe to assume that most Titanfall fans are eagerly waiting for what Titanfall 3's campaign has in store for us. Discussing the story and plotline of Titanfall 3 may seem pointless since there's a good chance that Respawn already has, at very least, an outline. But I still want to discuss my ideas about story and plot just to start a conversation on the topic. So please, if you have any story or plot ideas yourself, leave them down in the comment section. As for what kind of story and plot I would like to see in a future Titanfall game, well, it's actually been pretty difficult to flesh one out. You see, the problem I keep running into is that I feel like Titanfall 2 already played the best narrative card in Respawn's deck. Exploring the bond between a pilot and their Titan is probably the best story you can tell through the lens of Titanfall's mechanics. And ultimately, this is the reason why Titanfall 2's story was gripping, even though the plot itself was fairly weak. Titanfall 2's story was conveyed mostly through gameplay and mechanics, rather than completely relying on cutscenes and narration. It's a form of storytelling that only video games are capable of using, and I personally think that more story-based games need to start looking at what interactivity has to offer. So for future Titanfall narratives, the question really comes down to what other kind of stories and themes could be properly conveyed through Titanfall's mechanics. And for me, this has not been an easy question to answer. The safest bet for Respawn would probably be to continue the story of Cooper and BT, but in my opinion, this would be drawing too heavily from the themes of Titanfall 2. Not to mention that I feel Titanfall 2's campaign already wrapped up the character story of Cooper and BT in a satisfying way. This means that continuing their story would require Respawn to either add in new themes to explore, or keep treading in familiar waters. While adding in new themes on top of Titanfall 2's existing character story would probably be the safest route, I can't help but feel that there's little to actually gain from recycling the characters, other than the aforementioned element of safety. What I'm basically trying to say here is that if Respawn wants to explore new themes, I think it could be done better with a new cast of characters and a different perspective. Trying to find a new plot and theme that would fit in the Titanfall universe had really stumped me for a long time, but after brainstorming various different ideas, I think I may have stumbled onto something worth exploring. Titanfall 2's campaign featured a story from the militia's point of view, and mostly painted the IMC as the antagonizing faction. While this worked for the story that Titanfall 2 was trying to convey, I preferred the original Titanfall's characterization of either side. The IMC was an apathetic corporation fighting to maintain control over resources, while the militia were a ragtag group of rebels, pirates, and mercenaries fighting a war for freedom they had little hope of winning. While the IMC were still presented as the antagonizing faction in the original Titanfall, neither side was really black or white. While you could argue the militia was a lighter shade of grey than the IMC, I think Titanfall 1 left the door open just wide enough to explore their side. For those who don't know, or may have missed what happened in the original Titanfall's campaign mode, essentially what happened was an ex-IMC officer named James McCallan joined the militia after the IMC attacked a colony of civilians while pursuing the militia fleet. With McCallan's knowledge and intel, the militia conducted a number of raids on IMC territory, culminating in the Battle of Demeter. During the Battle of Demeter, McCallan sacrificed himself to ensure the destruction of Demeter's refueling depots. Inspired by McCallan's sacrifice and angered with the IMC's apathy and artificiality, Vice Admiral Marcus Graves, the leader of the IMC forces on the frontier, defected to the militia with an AI known as Spyglass being promoted to Vice Admiral in Graves' stead. Without Demeter's refueling depots, IMC reinforcements to the frontier have been effectively cut off for at least a few years. It's a real shame that the original Titanfall didn't have a dedicated single-player campaign, as I think its campaign actually had a lot of interesting ideas that couldn't be properly executed in a multiplayer-only game. I would even say that from a pure plot perspective, Titanfall 1's campaign was actually much stronger than Titanfall 2's. So for Titanfall 3, or a future Titanfall game, I would love if the story started where Titanfall 1 left off. Taking place after the events of Titanfall 2, the IMC reinforcements to the frontier would finally arrive. You would play as an IMC pilot tasked with assassinating key targets in the frontier like Marcus Graves and Sarah Briggs. This plot could also extend to General Martyr in the Ares division. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that even the IMC would disapprove of General Martyr's goals, viewing the destruction of an entire planet as bad for the company's image and a massive waste of valuable resources. There's even a semblance of evidence to support this in that during the Bounty Hunt game mode, the Ares division is often seen fighting the IMC's remnant fleet. This almost characterizes the Ares division as more of a rogue faction, somewhat similar to Cerberus in Mass Effect. A mission where you're tasked with assassinating General Martyr and destroying the Ares division headquarters could be an interesting part of the campaign. In general, I think this type of story leaves the campaign fairly open-ended, giving Respawn a lot of creative freedom to make some memorable missions with excellent level design. But all of this is really just plot, and not necessarily the story itself. In terms of story, what themes could this plotline explore? As I said earlier, I feel that Titanfall 2 already took advantage of the best theme that Titanfall's mechanics allow for. In some ways, I almost feel that any other theme would end up falling short of the bar that Titanfall 2 set. But regardless, I think another theme worth exploring would revolve around cold objectivity versus morality. You see, the thing about Titanfall is that you as a human are just as much of a lethal killing machine as the hulking monoliths of destruction that you pilot. You could argue that about most games that feature super soldiers, but the sheer scale of the conflicts you engage in combined with the speed at which you can kill enemies makes Titanfall somewhat unique in this aspect. It isn't a stretch to kill 10 people within 3 seconds when playing Titanfall 2's campaign. Combine this with some truly brutal animations and a sandbox of weapons which can only be described as a war crime with a trigger, and Titanfall can occasionally paint a pretty disturbing picture. These are some of the elements that an IMC-centered single-player campaign could really emphasize, and I think the first step in telling this kind of story would be to expand our understanding of the IMC's motives. Titanfall 2 sets up the IMC as an evil, greedy corporation, but that could just be the perspective of the militia in the frontier. Back in the core systems, where the IMC originates, it would be interesting to see a completely different picture altogether, where people are suffering on a daily basis due to a lack of natural resources. This would paint the IMC as being more desperate than flat-out evil, and while their actions are certainly immoral, they are at least understandable. After decades of seeing the situation in the core systems continuing to deteriorate, it isn't a stretch to think that the IMC slowly became jaded and apathetic to the effects of human suffering. This would make the actions they've taken against the militia much easier for the IMC to accept, with the justification that they need to acquire more resources in order for the core systems to prosper once again. And ultimately, the militia, no matter how good and noble their intentions may be, are an obstacle in the way of a greater good. This is where that theme of cold objectivity versus morality comes back into play, as you control the weapons and machines of war to assassinate your targets. From a gameplay perspective, you would be tasked with mercilessly killing people which previous games have already established as being morally correct, all in the name of a greater good. It's a story that could really ask if you are any less of a machine than the weapons and titans which you wage war with. Now the big problem with this story is that it's probably too heavy in nature. While I think this theme would be interesting to explore, it probably wouldn't be as fun to explore. Titanfall 2's campaign didn't exactly take itself too seriously, and I don't mean that as an insult. It's like an awesome 80s sci-fi action movie, not an artsy-fartsy philosophy lesson about human nature and morality. Heavy themes like these may not be conveyed very well through the lens of a 6 to 8 hour action FPS game, and should probably be left for a role-playing game, novel, or television series. This all leads back once again to the conclusion that the safest bet would be for Respawn to continue the story of Cooper and BT. While it may not be particularly innovative or original, it would probably be much easier to pull off effectively.
Fire is bulletproof. We're gonna breach the glass. Take your marks. Guy by the stairs. Tango on the mezzanine.
Shape charges are ready.
Hey, Coop, watch how the 6-4 does it. Pilot Cooper, you ready? I'm ready. Breach! That's how it's done.
Putting the narrative aside, what improvements can be made to the actual gameplay of the single-player experience? Besides the occasional minor nitpick, I can't really say that I have many criticisms of Titanfall 2's campaign from a gameplay perspective. Maybe a more intelligent AI, though Titanfall 2's was passable enough for the experience to be fun. The only major one I can think of would be to have more interesting boss fight mechanics. In Titanfall 2, most of the boss fights just kind of felt like a buffed version of the existing Titans. I would probably say that Sloan and Viper are kind of the exceptions, with Sloan occasionally phasing out of combat to drop reinforcements, and Viper flying above the battlefield while raining rockets down from above. Yet still, I think the boss fight should be a bit more mechanically interesting if they're going to be included in Titanfall 3. For example, imagine if in the Kane boss fight, the environment began to slowly catch fire. This would make maneuvering around Kane's thermite much more difficult as the fight progresses. Depending on the difficulty level you select, maybe the environment would catch fire faster, adding additional pressure. I think this would have been a lot more interesting and memorable than just fighting a Scourge with more health and occasionally being called a scrub.
So going to enjoy taking that Titan from you, scrub.
And this kind of brings up a larger conversation on enemy design. Now for the most part, I would actually say that Titanfall 2's enemy design was fairly well done. In general, there are enough differences between the various different enemy types to make them all feel unique and interesting to fight against. But at the same time, I don't think that Titanfall 2 reached the full potential of its universe in this regard. Enemies like the Spectre just don't feel all that different than grunts, with the only noticeable difference being that they seem more resistant to frag grenades. I think it would be kind of interesting if Spectres were a lot more agile and aggressive, jumping around and rushing the player with pure mechanical speed. And for all the mechanized enemies in general, it would be cool if all of their mechanical components was treated independent from the whole unit. Instead of just shooting it until it's dead, what if you could blow off individual limbs and pieces to remove their weapons and abilities? Think of the Loki mechs from Mass Effect 2, which I actually found was a really satisfying enemy to fight in that game for this reason in particular. For Stalkers and Reapers, what if you needed to blow off individual chunks of armor in order to expose their weak points to deal bonus damage? Now imagine this idea also applying to Titans, though for the sake of gameplay consistency, this idea should be relegated to the campaign only. The repair drone could also make an appearance in the campaign as it flies around to various wounded enemies and repairs their armor. This kind of leads into how enemies should react to taking damage. What if when you blew off both of a Spectre's arms, they would rush towards you and detonate their power supplies? For Stalkers, what if when you blew off one of their limbs, they would run over and reattach it? This would keep them somewhat stationary for a few seconds, allowing the player to flank them and shoot at their power supply. For Reapers, what if when they took severe enough damage, the ticks inside of them would break out, killing the Reaper and chasing down the player, kind of like the Flood carrier forms from Halo? For Titans, what if they had a doom state in the campaign? This would allow the player to perform more executions, but in addition, what if destroying exposed weak points while an enemy Titan was in a doom state would lead to some cool death animations, where a limb pops off before the entire Titan explodes? Sure, this is just a visual element, but I think players would really appreciate it regardless. And speaking of Titans, I was actually quite surprised that Titanfall 2 didn't feature pilot versus Titan combat. From watching a GDC talk where a Respawn developer spoke about creating levels for Titanfall 2's campaign, if I remember correctly, they actually planned for some pilot versus Titan fights, but had to cut it. It may seem like an odd thing to cut from the game, given that all the pieces are already in place, but playing Frontier Defense on the harder difficulties made me realize that things are a bit more complicated than that. The big issue with the Titan pilot matchup in Titanfall 2 is that most of the Titans feature weapons and abilities which can instantly kill a pilot. This leads to a situation where enemy Titans feel random and cheap to properly fight against, giving the player no indication of when they're about to die. While taking fire from enemy minions will slowly drain your health until you're dead, Titan encounters are completely binary. They either miss you completely in a laughable display of incompetence, or kill you outright in a way which feels cheap. It's different when it happens in multiplayer, since players know at a fundamental level that the other player used an element of skill and control to land their shot, but against the game's AI, it's just a roll of the dice. Sure, you could say that nerfing enemy Titan's weapon damage could be a viable solution, but being hit with a massive thermite shot or railgun round and surviving would probably feel quite jarring. But in some ways, I've already proposed a possible solution in my previous videos. In my vision of Titanfall 3, each Titan would have multiple weapons to choose from, and when creating Titans for players to fight against in the campaign, Respawn would have more weapon options to use when trying to balance Titan versus Pilot and Titan versus Titan encounters. And this leads me to yet another idea about the enemy design for Titanfall 3, enemy variants. This is actually a fairly simple concept, but in all my time playing games, the only developers I've ever seen take proper advantage of this idea were Bungie with the original Halo games. Bungie had this great idea of creating a hierarchy within the same types of enemies, which was very easy for players to visually identify. The most brilliant aspect of this system was how it allowed Bungie to create a plethora of different enemies which all had varying different gameplay demands for a relatively low amount of development effort. Creating enemies like the Elite Ultra only required Bungie to get the Elite Miner asset, scale up its health, give it access to better weapons, and change the color of its armor. As far as I know, this would have a relatively minor impact in the grand scheme of AAA game development, while at the same time having a massive impact on the gameplay and player experience. Facing an Elite Miner is nothing more than a moderate challenge at best, but fighting an Elite Ultra will leave you cowering in fear. Now imagine the same idea applied to Titanfall. Imagine a variant of Stalkers with heavier armor and EPGs, or a Reaper variant with regenerating energy shields. Maybe a squad of Spectres that still fight even after their heads have been blown off, or heavily armored Grunts with helmets that are immune to headshot damage. This idea could apply to Titans as well, like a heavy anti-Titan Legion variant with significantly more health, tougher weak point armor, and wielding an AT SMR. Or a fast, lightly armored Monarch variant that deploys support stations, repair drones, and fires missiles to assist friendly forces. This idea could also be used to create Titan variants that are more suited for pilot versus Titan gameplay, like a Scorch with a Dragon's Breath shotgun and less armor, rather than the standard beefy instant kill thermite launcher version. Titanfall Sandbox has a ton of potential for creating new enemy variants, and for the most part, I don't think that most of these variants would be too difficult for Respawn to implement, as they rely on assets that are already in the game, rather than requiring the developers to create something completely new from scratch. The only major changes that would need to be made would be some minor visual elements. This could be as simple as changing the color of the enemy to indicate to the player that they are fighting a different enemy variant. For Titans in particular, maybe some of the cosmetic armor unlocked from multiplayer could be used to create some visually distinct Titan variants in the campaign. In addition to an enemy variant system, Respawn could also implement an enemy randomizer as well. This is an idea that I've noticed when playing Halo 2 in particular, and although I don't think that Halo 2 takes full advantage of this mechanic, when it does happen, I really appreciate it. The way it seems to work is that certain encounters in Halo 2 have a certain range of enemy variants that can be spawned for the player to fight. In one playthrough of the campaign, a particular section may spawn 2 Elite Majors with a squad of Grunts, whereas in another playthrough of the campaign, that same section may spawn an Elite Miner and an Elite Ultra with a squad of Grunts. The enemy types remain consistent throughout the playthrough of Halo 2, but the variants that are spawned can range. You don't really notice it too often, especially if you play on the lower difficulties, but occasionally, when it does happen, it can be a pleasant surprise that makes for an unexpected twist in an otherwise predictable encounter, especially when you get that rare 1 in 100 Elite General to spawn. Sadly for Halo 2, I really only notice this happening in the first half of the game, and even then it's a bit too rare for it to really have any significant impact on one playthrough over the next. So for Titanfall 3, I would absolutely love and adore if this mechanic was not only brought into the game, but had an even more significant impact than it did in Halo 2. This would make each playthrough feel unique and less repetitive, with many encounters playing out a bit differently each time. This would also lead to some exciting gameplay moments, where you run into a particularly rare enemy variant that really tests your skills. This enemy variant system could also be brought over to Frontier Defense and the Ground War game mode that I proposed, but for the sake of consistency, I think in these modes the enemy randomizer should be turned off. And even in the campaign, some of you may say that this could create an element of random difficulty, leading to a frustrating experience for newer or less skilled players. This is an absolutely fair and valid criticism, so I think it's time that I talked about difficulty levels and challenge modifiers. Most games have a set of different difficulties which players can choose between to set their desired level of challenge. Some people only want to experience the story or need to learn the mechanics, while others are looking for a challenging gameplay experience. While having difficulty options is usually enough to offer players what they're looking for, I want to propose a completely new system that I've personally never seen done before. The idea is to give players a more fine-tuned approach to tweaking their difficulty levels to give themselves an experience that more closely resembles what they're looking for. Instead of just selecting a new difficulty which straps a bunch of changes to the existing gameplay, what if Respawn gave players access to a large set of challenge modifiers instead? Players could then select from a few different levels of each of these modifiers. For example, let's say there's a modifier which affects enemy Titan health. Players could use this modifier to select how many additional bars of Titan armor enemy Titans have. Let's say that players could choose to add 1, 2, 3, or no additional bars. If the player selected the no bars option, then Strider class Titans would only have 2 bars of armor, Atlas Titans would only have 3, and Ogre Titans would only have 4. But if the player selected 3 additional bars, then Strider class Titans would have 5 bars of armor, Atlas Titans would have 6, and Ogre Titans would have 7. In addition, maybe there would be a separate option for Titan shields. Players could choose between no shields, standard shields, or regenerating shields. No shields would obviously cause enemy Titans to have no form of shielding. Standard shields would cause enemy Titans to spawn with a layer of shields that don't regenerate, and regenerating shields would cause enemy Titans to spawn with a shield which does regenerate. Between just armor and shield options, I think these two modifiers would already have a massive impact on the player Titan combat experience. But these challenge modifiers could apply to many other aspects of the game than just enemy titans. Things like player health regeneration, enemy weak point armor strength, grunt health, spectre health, stalker health, reaper health, enemy accuracy, stronger enemy variant spawn chances, player titan health, player titan shields, player ammo capacity, amount of dropped weapon ammo, aim assist strength, boss fight difficulty, enemy flinch rate, enemy aggression, enemy explosive range, enemy explosive damage, enemy grenade throw chance, player explosive damage, player explosive range, player grenade carry capacity, and so many more. I could go on for hours about different challenge modifiers and to what degree they affect gameplay, but this series is already a little bit too in-depth. So if you have any questions about how these modifiers would function, or have any ideas yourself, we can continue this conversation down in the comment section. Now, some of you may point out that this level of detail would be way too overwhelming for most players to interact with, which is completely true. This is why I think that easy, normal, hard, and master difficulty options should still be in the game. However, when players select different difficulty options, they would simply toggle on various different degrees of these modifiers, and each difficulty option itself would just be a preset of challenge modifiers. For players who simply want to jump into the campaign without having to fuss over all of these settings, it would still be just as simple as choosing the difficulty and playing the game. I imagine that most people would probably want to play through the campaign first anyways, so they could get a feel for the difficulty before modifying it for themselves. I for one generally enjoy playing Titanfall 2 on Master, but I also find that the amount of pilot health I have is far too small to properly encourage me to play aggressively. Going back to hard feels way too easy, but Master can really limit the amount of fun I have in certain encounters when I have such a small health pool, and this is just one aspect of the game that I wish I could tweak to my liking. Now if I compare this to Halo 2 Anniversary for example, even a relatively limited amount of challenge modifiers allows me to craft a gameplay experience that's still fun, even after I've already played the game more than 100 times over the past 14 years. These are pretty much all of my ideas for how to improve the gameplay in a future Titanfall campaign. Some of you may wonder why I didn't really talk about level design, and it's because I don't think Respawn really needs any suggestions in that department. Having watched Respawn's GDC talk about the use of action blocks to create levels, I'm honestly astounded with the sheer amount of ideas that they have. If anyone is interested in the creation of Titanfall 2's single-player campaign, I would highly recommend watching that video. I'll even leave it linked in the video description for your convenience. The only ideas I have from a level design perspective are to include more tactical abilities in the campaign, or even have entire missions that focus on them. A mission that exclusively features a grappling hook to swing between dropships could be absolutely insane, or a stealth mission where you use cloak and strategic movement to bypass enemy patrols and assassinate a target, only for your cover to get blown after making the kill, and needing to use your Titan to go on a rampage killing everyone you just sidestepped. It would be like setting up a trail of dominoes and then watching them topple over. But I'm sure that whatever Respawn has in store is even better than anything that I can suggest, and I personally can't wait to see it. Anyways, I've talked long enough about the gameplay for Titanfall 3's campaign, so I think it's time that I moved on to the last topic of this video.
Pilot Cooper, Anderson is dead, but we can complete his mission if we can re-establish contact with the fleet. The interstellar beacon ahead will serve our needs.
Titanfall 2 brought many great innovations and changes to the franchise, but one aspect that I think the original Titanfall did much better was how the game felt. I don't really have too much to say about this as it isn't exactly a complicated idea, but I still think it's important to mention nonetheless. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like Titanfall 1 had a really interesting atmosphere that the sequel didn't quite capture. I think a lot of this came down to the art style of the original game, which felt a lot more industrial and mechanized. The original Titanfall wasn't afraid of showing a bleak setting, and although the colors were more drab and the environments were more depressing, I think this made Titanfall stand out. I've always found that the best looking games from an art style perspective were the games that managed to capture the story's thematic elements and its environments. The frozen wasteland of post-apocalyptic Russia as it's depicted in the Metro games is, in a way, hauntingly beautiful. While I probably wouldn't characterize Titanfall 1 in the same way, I think there was some value in its grungy mechanical depiction of the future. While most futuristic worlds present emerging technologies as being sleek and efficient, the original Titanfall felt more crude and dirty, which in a way tells a story of its own. When I look at the backdrop on Demeter, I don't see the idealistic future that I want. I see what looks like a dystopian futuristic industrial revolution. And sadly, I feel that Titanfall 2 falls into the trap of trying to feel overly beautiful and idealistic with some of its art direction. And in a way, it kind of lost its artistic identity. A good example of this is how the ships look in both Titanfall 1 and 2. I love the rigid industrial look of Titanfall 1's ship designs as it really complemented the atmosphere of the game. But in Titanfall 2, they were changed for a more sleek and rounded aesthetic that feels a bit more generic and, thick? In general, I find that many science fiction games are way too obsessed with capturing the beauty of space and technology rather than the horrors of it. Many games have what I call Earth 2.0 syndrome, where new planets found in space feel like slightly altered versions of locations here on Earth. Titanfall 2 certainly falls prey to this issue, but surprisingly, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare didn't. I never played Infinite Warfare, so I can't comment on its gameplay at all, but I did watch a playthrough of the campaign and was actually surprised at how well some of the things were done. There was a lot of hate directed towards Infinite Warfare, and while I didn't buy it since its gameplay didn't really appeal to me personally, I think a lot of the hate it received was unjustified, and a lot of people simply won't give credit where it's due. And honestly, I think Infinite Warfare and the developers who worked on it deserve some credit for their depiction of space. Infinite Warfare's art style is one of the best I've ever seen in a video game, and I love how space actually feels like space. The planets in Infinite Warfare don't feel like utopian paradises, but rather feel like the bleak, desolate death traps that they actually are. There's even a mission that takes place close to the sun, where if you step into the light you become somewhat blinded and start rapidly taking damage. Personally, I think that's actually a pretty brilliant mechanic that really emphasizes the true nature and dangers of space, not just visually, but through gameplay. So for Titanfall 3, I would love if Respawn took a bit of inspiration from what the artists at Infinity Ward accomplished. By combining Infinite Warfare's depiction of space with Titanfall 1's depiction of technology, I think Titanfall 3's art style could be absolutely stellar and recapture a lot of the atmosphere that I loved about the original game. Now there are two more things that I guess would also fit into this topic that I wanted to quickly go over. The first one I'll touch on is the music. Many of the things that I said about Titanfall's art style are applicable to its music as well, but I would probably say to a lesser degree. While I think that Titanfall 1 soundtrack is overall better and more unique, there are a few tracks from Titanfall 2 that I really enjoy, like the songs BT-7274, Rifleman Cooper, Link to Pilot, Arc Pursuit, and Trust Me. Believe me when I say that through making this video series, I've listened to both Titanfall 1 and 2's soundtrack extensively. It's important to note that Titanfall 2 soundtrack was made to underscore specific moments in the campaign, whereas the entire purpose of Titanfall 1 soundtrack was to establish the game's world and atmosphere. In this way, I would say that Titanfall 1 soundtrack actually had a significant advantage playing in its favor. Its soundtrack was mainly intended to instill feeling rather than accent it. So while Titanfall 2 had some pretty decent main tracks, I think Titanfall 1 soundtrack had a much more unique feeling. It was almost like a space western style with sinister undertones. Just listen to the song Here Be Dragons from Titanfall 1's soundtrack. That is honestly a brilliant piece of music at capturing the tone of Titanfall's setting. So for Titanfall 3, while I appreciate the value of a good orchestral main track, I really hope that the music can draw a bit more thematic inspiration from the first game. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is Titanfall's lore. I don't have too much to say on this topic as I'm not a really big lore guy myself, but I think that Titanfall could do a bit more to fully establish its lore and universe than it currently does. The community has actually done some pretty interesting speculation on this topic, so I think there is some demand for it. For those interested in lore speculation, I would highly recommend visiting A Flying Teacup and Roanoke Gaming on YouTube. The lack of lore in Titanfall is actually a pretty massive opportunity that Respawn could take advantage of. There are so many interesting avenues to explore with Titanfall's source material, and even as someone who isn't all that interested in lore, even I would love to know some more about Titanfall's technology and universe. So in Titanfall 3, I would love to see a lore section in the menus to explain some of the things that we see in-game. Maybe this could be tied to challenge and achievement progression, so as players progress through the game, they unlock more lore to delve into. Just please, for the sake of my sanity, please record a voiceover of the lore. I hate when games try to make me read 3 or 4 pages worth of lore. I don't mind listening to it, and I even listened to a lot of the voice logs in Titanfall 2's campaign. Even though General Martyr's speech was long, I actually found it quite interesting to listen to. But maybe it's just me who doesn't like reading lore, as I have a particular aversion to reading in general. But I think that's just about everything I want to talk about in regards to Titanfall's single player and universe, so now it's time to wrap this video up. Making this series has been a long journey for me. I say this as I read the end of a script that's over 100 pages single-spaced in length. Between writing the script, recording the gameplay, and editing, what you are watching is the culmination of over a year and a half of work. Some of you may think that I'm crazy for putting this much effort into a video series that most likely won't even get over 100 views per episode. But honestly, that's just how much I love Titanfall. There are just some things in life that inspire an unquantifiable level of appreciation, and for me, the sheer mastery of game design that is the Titanfall franchise is one of them. Titanfall 2 will always have a place in my heart, because it was a game that reminded me what it felt like to fall in love with games for the first time. While I'm sure that many people will disagree, I personally think that Titanfall 2 is one of the greatest games ever made. I hope the men and women over at Respawn Entertainment feel proud about what they accomplished. I doubt that anyone over at Respawn will ever watch this series, but if they do, I just wanted to say that regardless of whether or not you think any of my ideas or suggestions are good, I trust that the next Titanfall game will be amazing. The franchise is in great hands, and I think there are bright skies on the horizon. This has been iFlawed 101, and I hope to see all of you on the frontier.